Thank you all for coming tonight. We welcome you to one of our public speakers programs. We've had a series of public speaking events at the Council, usually tackling very hot areas in the world, and we try to make it very timely. We had series of talks on Middle Eastern issues, and last month we had a great talk about the opening with Cuba. And today we're very privileged and fortunate to host Ambassador Marc Grossman to speak on Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is one of the hot areas around the world as well. So for those of you who are attending this function today, welcome, and we hope to see you again. You probably received the program on your seats. We've had great speakers, as I said, and in April and May we have also very interesting topics with distinguished speakers speaking on Latin America, or about Russia, and about the leadership role of Germany in the world. The Council is a 90 years old organization in Cleveland. It's one of the oldest civic organizations founded by visionaries who were interested in international affairs. And one of the main programs that we carry on in the city is the Model UN program. Many of you heard about it, probably your children went through it. We've touched thousands of lives through this program, and it's been very successful. And today I'd like to take one extra minute to tell you about the program. The Council on World Affairs started the United Nations program in Cleveland 70 years ago. So this was a 70-year anniversary. And we just received a congratulation note from Secretary General of UN, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, about the successful continuous program for 70 years here. There was a function last week that hosted about 400 local students from 20 area high schools to celebrate this anniversary. And this was, again, one of the longest programs, and we're committed to expanding the program throughout the county and even with the adjacent counties. So one of the main missions of the Council is to expand this successful model. Our speakers program I mentioned, and then our third line of projects is hosting International Visitor Program. This is the program sponsored by the State Department. They invite people and delegates from all over the world to come to United States for a limited period of time. And they tour them around different cities to meet their counterparts in different professions. They range from parliamentarians to engineers to physicians to nurses to lawyers. And it's been very successful, very rewarding experience as well. And Cleveland became one of the leading cities in this program through the Council on World Affairs. We host about 250 to 300 guests every year. And the nice thing about this, you'll get to meet them, and we have opportunities that you can host them for dinner over your homes. And this has been very rewarding exchange of cultural and social encounters. So we encourage you, if you have any interest in hosting international visitors, please also ask our staff to connect you and put you on the list. We're very privileged as well to have our president, Ambassador Heather Hodges, who's a Clevelander, and she's the president of the Council, and she will introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much. Very nice to see all of you here tonight for a very special event. I'm very pleased to welcome Marc Grossman here to Cleveland. For many years, his name was one of the best known names at the Department of State. He was the ambassador to Turkey. He was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and from 2001 to 2005, he was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. That person is the number 3 position in the Department of State, and as the name indicates, it is one of the most important positions for anyone to have, and as far as influencing U.S. Foreign policy and the execution of U.S. foreign policy. Mark is also what the insiders at the Department of State, most people don't know this term outside of the Department of State, but he's a career ambassador, which is one of those rare titles that is given only to those who have, given extraordinary service to the Foreign Service. When Mark left the Department of State in 2005, he became vice chairman of the Cohen Group, which is the position that he holds today. However, in 2001, he was asked, lured, coaxed to come out of retirement and to serve as the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. This was based on his extensive diplomatic background and his knowledge of the area. He served in that role for a year. Then finally, something that is very important for those of us who are in the Cleveland Council of World Affairs, he was the chair of the board of the World Affairs Councils of America, known as WACA, and that is our umbrella group here for the CCWA. Mark fully appreciates our mission to educate people globally and knows exactly the kind of work that we do. So it's really especially nice to have him here for that reason. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that very kind introduction. First of all, let me all thank you for coming out here on an evening to listen to a talk on Afghanistan and Pakistan. I certainly appreciate it. One of the things that is kind of frightening a little bit when you kind of hear these introductions, Ambassador this and Assistant Secretary that, people kind of get confused. And I was at an event some months ago and someone was kindly making the same introduction and kind of got lost in all those titles and finally said, here's Ambassador Grossman, what an extinguished career. Sorry, that's how this goes. Actually, a very good experience just this evening. A gentleman here, who I will remain nameless, asked me if I knew anything about the speaker and whether was it going to be any good. I said, quick, go have 2 glasses of wine and leave. He said, I can't, I already paid. So you'll have to stick with me here for a few minutes and see how it goes. Let me thank you all very much for coming, and if I could just thank everyone who's been involved in the wonderful arrangements that have been made. I see so many friends here from the Cleveland Clinic, Alcoa, others who are here, and we appreciate that very much. I also wanted to make an acknowledgement tonight for one reason, and that is that I sometimes think, and perhaps this audience means that I was wrong, but I sometimes feel that Afghanistan and Pakistan these days are kind of yesterday's story. Everybody's thinking about something else. So I'm very glad to see all of you out here tonight, and I hope that you'll join me just for a moment in remembering that we still have an enormous number of people, both military and civilian, serving in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think they're worth your thoughts each day because they're out there still trying to pursue the interests of the United States in some very, very hard places. Ambassador Hodges, Heather knows all about this, and thank you very much. And I was delighted to hear on the way in today that a Clevelander, so back to Cleveland, and it's a wonderful thing. And I appreciate very much your kind of mentioning the 2 years that I had the honor to be the president or the chairman of the board of the National World Affairs Councils of America. What a great organization, founded just at the end of World War I with this desire to educate and inspire and have people engaged in the world. And so I don't take any of these conversations at all lightly. When people from World Affairs Council say, come, I like to come because I admire what it is that you do. You're committed to this engagement of the United States of America in the world, and that's an enormously important thing. And so the World Affairs Council here, the other World Affairs Councils around the country, I think you make an enormous contribution to the conversation that Americans need to have about what our role is in this world and how to pursue it. So I thank you very much for that. Heather asked me to come tonight and talk a little bit about what next in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I'd like to start first with Afghanistan and then go to Pakistan and then maybe bring the two of them together. But to start, you need to kind of join me in getting a mental picture here. And my question to you about Afghanistan is what impressions, what predictions best describe for you Afghanistan as this country tries to manage the huge change that faces it as the international combat mission, which ended last December, and now they move to a fully Afghan-led, Afghan-owned future. And so what's in your mind when you think about that question? Is it the latest terrible Taliban attack on Afghan civilians or international forces? Or is it the strength and the resilience that has been shown by the Afghan National Security Forces, the ANSF, as they fight the extremists even in the face of very high casualty numbers, very high desertion numbers, a struggle to get the right kind of training and equipment? In your mind, when you think about Afghanistan, is it Afghanistan's poverty? Afghanistan's corruption? Or is it the news that between 2002 and 2012, as measured by the United Nations, Afghanistan had the greatest improvement in human development, a measure of health, education, life expectancy, economic growth, of any country in the world? When you hold this thought about Afghanistan, do you think about what for me was the heartbreaking and frustrating and way too long conversation between presidential candidates Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, which now seems to be resolved? Or do you hold in your mind the election last spring in which 7 million Afghans voted, 40% of whom were women, and the well-documented opinions of Afghans that recognize their progress has been made possible by the sacrifices, first of them, but also America and our friends and our allies? And so it seems to me that any judgment that you make about what next in Afghanistan has to start there. And start by recalling what has been achieved and recalling that poll after poll after poll says that Afghans think their country's headed in the right direction. Poll after poll says that Afghans believe they're better off than they were at any time under the Taliban. I won't give you too many statistics this afternoon, but let me give you a few. In 2002, there were in the neighborhood of 900,000 Afghan children in school, all boys. Last year, there were 10 million Afghan children in school, 40% of whom were girls. The number of teachers in Afghanistan increased from 20,000 in 2002 to 175,000 today, 30% women. Access to basic health services risen from 9% in 2001 to 60% today. And I think remarkably, life expectancy in Afghanistan went from 42 years in 2001 to 62 years today. Afghanistan's GDP grows 9% a year. In 2001, there were 21,000 mobile phone contracts in Afghanistan, and last year, 16 million. In 2002, 16 kilometers of paved roads, nearly 2,500 kilometers today, and 80% of the population has greater access to markets, schools, clinics, and government services. 3,000 women-owned businesses and associations, and not enough, but some women in parliament, some women in the cabinet. And 80% of women have access to a mobile phone. 50 television stations, 150 radio broadcasters, 1,000 newspapers, and the one I love the best, 475,000 Afghans are on Facebook. So don't put me here as someone who's naive. Afghanistan still faces enormous problems. This is the fourth poorest country in the world. Terrible corruption, terrible poverty, the need for stronger governance and security, many issues that remain before there's a full participation of women in Afghan society. But Afghanistan's not the same country it was in 2001, and they so far seem that Afghans will fight for what they've achieved at such great cost. So the 2 years that I had the privilege of being the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, 2011, 2012, after Dick Holbrooke so suddenly passed away, I come today to ask you to think about these 4 things as you're trying to figure out what next in Afghanistan and Pakistan. First, can President Ghani and Chief Executive Officer Abdullah see the larger interests of their country? And no one knows the answer to that question, but so far they seem to have worked out some kind of functioning arrangement. And the U.S. role in this has been hugely important. And my successor and Secretary Kerry, heavily involved in the conversation between these two people who've got to get this right for Afghanistan. Second, what about the Afghan National Security Forces? You've been reading in the newspaper these last few days, heavy casualties, many desertions, hard time keeping up with the Taliban. But what strikes me is that in battle after battle, conflict after conflict, they fight. Because I believe, as I said, they're going to fight for what they've achieved since 2001. The idea that the Taliban will come knock, knock, knock on the door in Afghanistan and say, hey, we're going back to 2001, that Afghans will say, sure, let's go back. I don't think so. They're not going back, and I think they'll fight. The question for us is whether we have, as a country, we in the international community, the patience and the capacity to help them in their fight. Not our fight anymore, but the capacity to help them in their fight. And so the second thing I think it's worth keeping an eye out for is whether the international community can meet the pledges that it's made to support the Afghan National Security Forces. Think back to 2012 when we negotiated a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan and said, we're committed to the future of this country, economically, politically, militarily. Turned into a bilateral security agreement between the United States and Afghanistan, and a similar one with NATO. Meetings in Chicago in 2012 at a NATO summit and after, saying that we're going to stay committed to helping the Afghan National Security Forces defend Afghanistan. And so for me, I know it was difficult, and I know it was controversial, but I thought President Obama did the right thing to decide to leave 9,800 American troops in Afghanistan on January 1, 2015. And the question now is, what happens next? Does that number go down, as the president suggested, and in a couple of years it'll be zero? Or you can see now the debate has begun, and it's something for Americans to consider as to whether that number ought to stay there, at least some number of troops, for longer. And you can see that American commanders in Afghanistan have started to begin this conversation. And if you follow this yesterday in the New York Times in the editorial said, don't do it. Keep to president's schedule. Let the troops leave. So that's a question for all of us. As you decide what next, the second important thing here is to make sure that we understand what's happening next to the Afghan National Security Forces. Third, keep an eye on economic growth. Here again, the international community has got to measure its commitments and make sure that Afghans are responsible for Afghanistan. That self-reliance is the word, but that there's some support from the private sectors in the United States and other countries around the world. It's also important that these combinations of assistance to Afghanistan, especially taxpayer assistance, and reform in Afghanistan, and changes in corruption and the way that they do business, that there's a balance there, and that there's a connection between what we give and what we do. It was interesting to watch that at the end of last year, in December of last year actually, there was an international conference on Afghanistan held in London. And Ashraf Ghani came, the president, and said, here's our paper, and our paper is about self-reliance, and our paper is about reform, and all good things. But one of the things that the international community, led by the United States, said, that's good, and we expect those things. But we want also to remind you of the commitments that were made in Tokyo at an international conference in 2012, that our assistance is not connected to your actually doing these things. And so that's the judgment that we, as taxpayers, will have to make going forward. I mentioned the private sector, and that is, I think it's also important to make sure that we understand the important role that the private sector can play. More than 16,000 new businesses were registered in Afghanistan between 2004 and 2011. And while lots of support has been proposed for Afghanistan from aid, official development assistance, the international organizations, I don't think international taxpayers are going to be giving money to Afghanistan forever. And so what's going to fill that gap? And what fills the gap, I believe, is the private sector. And so there's an important role for us here to encourage people to think about Afghanistan and the whole South Asian region, by the way, in a new way. And one of the things that Mrs. Clinton was kind enough to do for us in July of 2011 is announce an idea for the United States of America called the New Silk Road, to try to connect the economies in Central Asia with the Indian economy, with Afghanistan and Pakistan in the center. So those two countries could benefit first from transit trade, but ultimately from foreign direct investment and business and the kinds of things that only the private sector can do best. I notice now that if you Google New Silk Road, the Chinese president has taken on this title, has traveled through Central Asia, and trying to promote their vision of economic growth. All right, I say. Somebody, though, has got to take this responsibility and provide jobs for people in Afghanistan. Because in his book, Monsoon, Robert Kaplan provides a view of the larger connections, and this is the only quote I'll give you tonight. Stabilizing Afghanistan, he said, is about more than just the fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It's about securing the future prosperity of the whole of southern Eurasia. Final thing to watch, the fourth thing on the what's next list. For Afghanistan, that's whether it's possible to have a peace process in Afghanistan. Because the one thing's for sure is that this conflict between the Afghans and the Taliban isn't going to end militarily. So what's the political solution there? And how can Afghans talk to other Afghans about the future of Afghanistan? It seems to me, so far at least, as an observer of this now, that President Ghani is committed to this peace process. But the question is, what about the Taliban? And when I put myself, or I try to put myself anyone in their shoes, I hope what they see over this last year has been two important elections in Afghanistan, a signed bilateral security agreement with the United States, a robust residual force, both Americans and friends and allies, an Afghan national security force so far willing and able to fight, and continued economic growth. And you have to think that somewhere, wherever they are, that Mullah Omar and his leaders say to themselves, we can't win this fight militarily. Now, there are many ifs involved in this. One of them is the role of Pakistan, and I'll come to that in a minute. The question, as I say, of what the Taliban considers, and then the debate that Afghans will have inside of their own society about how far and how quickly and what's possible with the Taliban. Because as I'll tell you in a minute, the story of trying to talk to them is also a story about how Afghans felt. And there were so many Afghans as we were trying to reach out to open the door to an Afghan conversation with the Taliban who said, be careful, especially women, young people, entrepreneurs. And so there's a debate to be had inside of Afghan society as well. I think before we come to some answer about the what next on the peace process, it is worth just spending a minute or two, if you'd allow me, and tell you the story about our attempt, the U.S. attempt, to sustain a dialogue with the Taliban. Those of you who follow this story know that our instructions to do so came from a speech that Secretary Clinton gave in February of 2011 in New York, in fact, in honor of Dick Holbrooke after his death. And she said, don't forget what's going on here. There's a military surge going on at that time, needs to be supported. There's a civilian surge. All of the people from the State Department, from the Defense Department, from the Treasury Department, all over, who are trying to make the kinds of statistics that I gave you today real. We should support them. But she said, you know, there's a big missing piece here in our policy. And the missing piece is there's no diplomatic surge. There's no effort to test the proposition of whether the Taliban is interested in sitting down with the government of Afghanistan to try to come to some political end to this conflict. And so among the very first things that I learned when I arrived at my desk was that an allied government had put the United States in contact with someone who seemed to be an empowered representative of the Taliban. Contact was preliminary, but a lot of people thought that perhaps this might be a way to open the door to the thing that was required to move forward, which is that Afghans needed to talk to other Afghans about the future of Afghanistan. And such talks had proved impossible up until then because the Taliban refused to speak to the government of Afghanistan. And so the intriguing possibility for us was to see whether it might be possible for the United States, using American diplomacy, to open that door. Our preliminary conversations began with a contact team meeting with the Taliban in Europe and the Gulf, and I began to participate in these talks in mid-2011, and then chaired the interagency team that had these conversations until the Taliban broke off these talks in the middle of March 2012. You can imagine that one of the first questions I asked myself is, who is that across the table from me? And we came over time to believe that the person who was there was competent, that he was committed, he was capable of doing the kinds of things that we were interested in doing, not negotiating a peace for Afghans, that was for Afghans to do, but to see if we could develop some confidence-building measures so that that door could be opened for those peace talks to begin. The confidence-building measures included, as you'll recall, the Taliban opening a political office in Doha in Qatar where Afghans could get together to talk about how to end this conflict. We were clear, though, that that office was not about recruiting more Taliban, financing more Taliban, or to be some alternative government of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is what the Taliban calls themselves. The confidence-building measures also included the requirement that the Taliban make a public statement or statements disassociating themselves from international terrorism and accepting a political process in Afghanistan. And it also included the possible transfer of Taliban prisoners from Guantanamo and the release of U.S. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who'd been a captive of the Taliban since 2009. As we talked in Qatar, we realized that the Taliban's main objective was to get their prisoners released from Guantanamo. And they were convinced they had leverage on us because of Bergdahl, the person that they held. And both sides tried unsuccessfully to use their prisoner as a foundation for a larger arrangement. And in the end, we were unable to make any agreement with the Taliban on any part of this confidence-building measure sequence. But you notice, as you all who follow this know, that a lot of these issues keep coming back and back and back. Because when the Taliban announced in March of 2012 they were suspending talks with the United States, there were a lot of people who speculated, well, why? A number of observers said that the Taliban were having a very hard time motivating their fighters for that spring, because their fighters were saying, well, why should I fight when you all are talking to the Americans in Qatar? Other people also said that the Taliban said they were suspending the talks because we'd reneged on our promises about Guantanamo, untrue, and to keep faith with President Karzai, we'd added some steps to the confidence-building sequence, which certainly was true. But you could see then that the attempt to open a Taliban office in June of 2013, which was a failure, kept these issues on the agenda. And the decision last year to swap 5 Taliban prisoners in order to get Sergeant Bergdahl home was a reflection both of our commitment never to leave anyone behind and the shrinking influence we would have as December 2014 came near. I think about the controversy that occurred after Sergeant Bergdahl was released. It was interesting to me because people came up to me and said, well, would you have done this? Why should we get him back? What about those 5 Taliban? You know, and I referred constantly to the spokesperson of the Defense Department, a Navy admiral, who kept saying, listen, here's the thing, I'm in the Navy, he said. It doesn't matter whether you get pushed off the ship, whether you jumped off the ship, or you fell off the ship. We're going to turn the ship around, we'll pick you up, and then we'll decide what to do. And I think that's right. And so for all of the controversy that got generated, having worked on this problem a long time, the idea that we would just leave someone there seemed beyond comprehension to me. And the idea that he then has to face whatever procedures he will face, fair enough. But the idea to leave him there was never conceivable to me. What's clear now, though, is that there's a need for this Afghan peace process. And that's what Secretary Clinton tried to highlight for everybody in her speech in 2011. One more point I think that's important to make about this conversation we were having with the Taliban, and that is from my perspective, and I think all of us who were part of the American team, there's of course a moral ambiguity involved here in speaking to someone across the table who's also involved in an organization fighting your forces on the very same day. And we tried to clarify that ambiguity by sticking to American values and American principles. And we believe that any arrangement we managed to make with the Taliban would have to meet not just the standards that Secretary Clinton said in her speech, which was don't forget for the Taliban to renounce terrorism, to lay down their arms, to be prepared to live inside of a society in Afghanistan that valued rights, and especially the rights of women. But in the end, it also came down to me for the conviction described by Bertie Ahern, who, as many of you know, a former Irish prime minister who was involved in talking to the IRA. And he said, you ask yourself, can I stop the killing for the next decade? Because I can't stop it for the last one. And are these people willing, if the circumstances were different, to move into a political process? And the reward is if they are, he said, there aren't so many funerals. So a discussion of this conversation with the Taliban is actually a very good way to kind of shift now and talk about what's next in Pakistan. Because Pakistan, of course, has an enormous interest, not just in the stability of Pakistan, but the stability in Afghanistan and the stability of South Asia as a whole. And as I'll tell you, they were very important players in this conversation that we tried to have with the Taliban. Here again, I ask you to participate in that same kind of thought with me. What impressions do you have of Pakistan today? And how do you think about it? How do you think about what's next? You think about the politics in Pakistan, a frail democracy under siege. And yet in 2013, an election in Pakistan, for the first time in Pakistan's history, one parliament completed its business, people voted, and a new parliament took shape. So yes, politics are fragile. Yes, politics are challenging. But the Pakistanis have in their sense some vision of what their society could be like. I believe the answer to that is true. Do you hold in your mind when you think about Pakistan, a country that for too long has tried to choose between terrorists and extremists, or a country now that seems committed to combating all terrorism and extremism and supporting, as I said, a peace process in Afghanistan? A country that has enormous challenges, obviously, in its relationships with India. And yet a conversation beginning there, as we were talking about a little bit before this talk, more economic connections between the two countries. But just yesterday, a report that Pakistan has launched a missile now, which certainly can cover all of India. So huge challenges there. And then finally, the question of economic life in Pakistan. Again, a country with tremendous economic challenges, and yet there are American companies who do extremely well in Pakistan. Pakistanis taking advantage of this idea of the new Silk Road. Pakistanis participating in the economic life of the region. And so again, just like with Afghanistan, kind of what's past is very important to think about what's next. And when I look back, I think about 2011, an awful year in U.S.-Pakistan relations. Year began with the case of Raymond Davis, who was a U.S. contractor who shot and killed two Pakistanis when he thought he was the target of a robbery, mesmerized both governments for months. On May 2nd, 2011, U.S. Special Forces killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad. And after an initial very positive reaction by the government of Pakistan, Pakistanis then focused on what they said was a U.S. violation of their sovereignty, and U.S.-Pakistan relations deteriorated again. In September 2011, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul was attacked by fighters from the Haqqani network, a terrorist gang that operated from Pakistani territory. And on November 26, 2011, 24 Pakistani soldiers were accidentally killed on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border by U.S. aircraft. By the end of 2011, we just thought the best thing was to let Pakistan be and let Pakistanis have a debate in their own country about how their relationship with the United States should be made of. And by the middle of the next year, they did so, and the parliament in Pakistan passed a series of resolutions about what U.S.-Pakistan relations ought to be about. They weren't perfect from our perspective, but they were beginning of a conversation, and we tried to build from there. One of the things that was clear to me from these resolutions is the Pakistanis were talking about a country that was strong and that was sovereign, and it could be a real partner of the United States, and something that we encouraged and that we respected, but that we needed some work to be done. And so all through the rest of 2012, we tried to get this conversation with Pakistan going. Vital to all of it, and very much connected to the story I told you about the conversation with the Taliban, was the Pakistanis' desire to see some kind of change that would be positive for them in Afghanistan. So if you think about Pakistan today, what's next? So the first thing to judge is there really a change in Pakistan's attitude toward counterterrorism and toward militancy? I noticed, as perhaps many of you did, that Secretary Kerry took his last visit to Pakistan just about a month after that horrible attack on the students in Peshawar. And the question is, can this horrible occasion, terrible attack, galvanize the political and military elite in a new way against militancy? We'll see. Some people argue that what's happened is that there's been more control now organized by the military. Others point to Pakistan's new National Action Plan against terrorism, which reflects an internal civil-military consensus supported, I would say, by all political parties on the need to take action against all terrorism. And indeed, give credit where credit is due. Pakistan has organized a very large effort against terrorist presence in the Fatah, in the northwest frontier. Perhaps a third of Pakistan's army is deployed there, and they've taken substantial casualties. They've disrupted militant activity in the tribal areas, important seizures of weapons and materials for improvised explosive devices, which of course kill Afghan and American soldiers in Afghanistan. So the what next here is, can this effort keep going? And will Pakistanis decide that all terrorism is terrorism and all terrorism and extremism needs to be defeated? Second, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Can there be a reconciliation? Will it lead to the kind of peace process we were talking about before? Because Pakistan's relations with its neighbors play an important part in its security and prosperity. Again, as an observer, it seems to me that Pakistanis have taken quite positively to President Ashraf Ghani's elections, and that there are real chances for improvements in relations with the new government in Kabul. The number of visits from Pakistan to Afghanistan, from Kabul back to Islamabad, have increased substantially. On a recent visit, the Chief of Army Staff in Pakistan went to Kabul and said he was going to arrange to fix the Afghan Taliban, to be part of the peace process with Pakistanis. And that would be an enormous, enormous step forward. Third, what next? Well, that's India and Pakistan, and here the news isn't nearly as good, because Pakistan and India have come, as they do from time to time, to be kind of in quite a grind with one another. And while he was there, I'm sure Secretary Kerry encouraged Pakistan to do more to engage India, and I'm sure he conveyed a similar message in reverse to Prime Minister Modi. Been firing on the line of control, challenges in the working boundary in Kashmir. But I noticed that the Peshawar school attack prompted an outpouring of sympathy from India, with Prime Minister Modi personally calling for 2 minutes of silence in Indian schools in a gesture of solidarity. So what next? What next is a judgment that we will all have to make as Pakistanis and Indians manage their own problems. Fourth, and that is the question of the domestic issues in Pakistan. And let me first be clear. I've come to the clear conclusion. Pakistan is for Pakistanis. Pakistanis will have to decide how they want to live. And the way Pakistan is today is, I think, very much a result of decisions that they have made. And that's right. So they have decisions to make for themselves. And so the question that we have as Americans is whether there's any way that we can support a more pluralistic, a more tolerant, a more economically viable Pakistan. And that's why staying engaged with this country, as challenging as it is some days, is hugely important. So I come back to where I started. What do you take out of all of this? When you think about Afghanistan and Pakistan, an optimist, pessimist. And I conclude this way. The 29 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, 2 years as service as a special representative in Pakistan, taught me that the best diplomats are optimists. Because diplomats believe in the power of ideas, they believe that sustained effort can lead to progress, and they believe that diplomacy can help nations and groups avoid bloodshed. And so while there are enormous challenges in South Asia, perhaps those ideas will sustain us as we think about what could be next in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.